snake plant. It's probably most commonly known by that name. Another one that is very well known by his mother-in-law's tongue. It's got nice sharp edges and a point on it as well, and also very, very easy to grow. You've almost definitely seen one of the varieties around somewhere. Once again, similar to the Zanzibar gem, regularly put in place like shopping centres and offices because it's quite happy without much sun. Now, there's interesting factors about the snake plant as well, is it's actually a desert dwelling plant. Its natural environment tends to be extremely dry as well as very bright. But what we're most used to seeing them in is low light. So when they get a lot of sun, they tend to end up looking more bleached out like this. So you get a really, really pale look to them. But your more common sort of looks tends to be a lot darker like this. This is when they're getting a lot more shade. Now, with my personal experience so far, it would appear that their youth has a big impact on how dark they actually get. So if they're getting a lot of sun when they're young, it's going to take a long time, if at all, for them to get dark. Whereas if they get very little sun when they're young, they tend to stay darker more easily and take a lot longer to bleach out. So it's an interesting little factor if you ever try propagating or growing them yourself. If you've got them really young and you want that darker look, try to keep them out of the sun a bit, or less direct sunlight. Now, one of the other interesting things with the snake plants is a few variations of them, or they call them a variegation, or once again, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, but it's basically as written. So your normal snake plant is basically like this one here. So it's a lot more plain, stripy and so forth. And the most common variegation is this essential variety. So more green with a yellowy edge to it. When people think snake plant, that tends to be the variety that most people think. If you're actually playing any computer games or anything like that, where you're actually putting plants around, almost every single illustration or computer game of a snake plant that you'll ever see will be the variegation with the white edge, even though it is actually considerably rarer. Now, propagating them in and of itself is relatively straightforward. It's quite a simple process. However, it takes a really, really long time to see the actual results. So if you're not aware of the time frame that you're up for, you could wind up just giving up and deciding, oh, it's not going to work. And I know that's actually the case for several of the ones that I did. And it was at the point where I thought, oh, well, it's dead, I might as well chuck it. And then all of a sudden I saw a little shoot coming through and it's like, oh, wow. I had a similar result with the Zanzibar gem, in fact, where I'd actually completely forgiven up on it. And about 3 months later, looked at the pot and there was actually something shooting through. And it was like, oh my God, there we go. But I'll give you an idea of your basic propagation techniques. So technique number one, well, actually two different techniques you can basically see as a basic example visually here. So this one was actually from a cutting that I did of a variegated one. Planted it and took forever, but what we've got is the two plants have basically shot through here. Now the interesting thing, if you may notice, is we have a variegated one and a standard. Now, a variegated snake plant, if you grow from a cutting, will almost always give you a standard. They do not grow back as a variegated. I don't believe it's totally impossible for it to happen, but the chances are extremely slim. The alternative is you need to actually separate the rhizomes. It's a similar scenario to what I explained in the Zanzibar gem. So basically, as they grow and start to spread out, you'll actually get that rhizome will basically start to have separate entities, like quite obvious, where you can separate. The ones that I have done in the past with these, the rhizomes themselves are very obvious, but the root system connecting the two is also quite clear, and generally you're going to have to cut or break that depending on how delicate you are. Generally you want to allow that to dry out a bit as well before planting it. So without digging this up, you can actually see relatively straightforward from what's actually above the surface at the moment, to give you an idea of what's below. So this one's actually managed to grow, it's separated out a bit because the pot was big enough that it allowed it. So you're going to have a rhizome basically under here, a rhizome basically under here. So if I wanted to essentially create two brand new plants, I'd pull that out, I'd separate this rhizome and I'd separate that rhizome, and then that'll eventually continue on and grow and spread out and make their own. In fact, I think there I'd probably be able to separate two rhizomes there, in fact, and I believe here probably have two rhizomes I would be able to separate there. So I could theoretically and highly likely take that, make 4 plants, which would then continue to spread out in a similar fashion to how that is. That's probably where you're going to get it more commonly. They tend to bunch together, and then you're going to have to be more careful, or put it in a much larger pot so that it sort of spreads more. So here's the thing with it. Now, if you have a variegated snake plant, like that dark green with the yellow on the sides as an example, and you want to propagate that and keep the variegation, you really need to do the rhizome separation technique. Nice and slow and steady, and basically you're only getting a new plant every time it basically shoots out and spreads and creates a new branch, for want of a better word. So that is the way it needs to be done, which is also another factor as to why variegateds will always cost more than the standard, because the standard is much easier. So if you just like the snake plant, you're not overly fussed on the particular appearance and coloration, then you can actually do it from cuttings. And doing it from cuttings is actually disturbingly easy and effective. So basically, I don't know just how harsh you can actually get with it, but in essence, all you really need to do is basically cut the leaf. Now, the technically best way to do it is to cut it nice and close to the ground. I know you can cut it significantly higher with success. As I said, I don't know just how, vicious you can actually get with it. In theory, you could cut that into multiples and do it, but I don't know whether or not that actually works. But the principle is, cut the plant. You'll need to leave it and allow it to dry a bit. Now, what I have seen is that a technique that seems to allow for rooting faster and better is to actually, where you do the cut, then do a V-shaped wedge in it. If you actually put that then into some water, after a while, the roots will start to actually show. Once again, you need to let it dry first, so it sort of calluses over. It takes maybe a day or two, and then you put it in the water, let the roots grow. Once you start seeing the roots, then you plant it into the soil, and then wait until it eventually grows. And that's the essential process. From that explanation, you can tell that they're actually getting another plant from your snake plant is actually a relatively easy process. And doing that as well is a very, very high level of success. You can do that cutting and plant it straight into the soil and let it go. Once again, allow it to callus over. You can do it without letting it callus over. It's actually entirely possible and can work. The downside to that is it's a higher risk that you'll get an infection into it and you'll wind up with rot or some other problem occurring. Allowing it to callus over reduces that risk, so it's better to do it, and all you're doing is cutting yourself back by a day or two, so who cares ultimately. Putting it in the water instead of the soil allows you to actually see when something's happening, which always feels a lot better. I'm not certain whether it's actually any significant difference in the speed of it, but it definitely feels better. It also lets you know that it's working. So putting it in the water, waiting until the roots start to show, stick it in the dirt, give it a bit of water. Do not overwater a snake plant. Similar to the Zanzibar gem, they're very content to have almost no water. But the other thing to remember is that the snake plant is, in essence, a desert plant. So it doesn't actually like a lot of water. You know, it actually prefers to have very, very little. So you can add a little extra perlite to it, the succulent and cacti mix, if you like. It's not necessary, but you know, that will allow more drainage, help keep the soil a little bit drier. They are a lot more prone to the root rot from being too wet than the Zanzibar is. So just be cautious of that. Both the Zanzibar gem and the snake plant are perfect plants for indoors, for people who tend to forget, neglect, just want something that's really, really easy to look after. They're also great for purifying. Now, I haven't personally done the cutting and putting it in water method myself before. However, like this one was a cutting that I basically allowed to callus, then put in the dirt. So I know that definitely works. And this was, in fact, the one that I mentioned before that I almost gave up on and thought wasn't going to work at all before I finally saw some shoots starting to come through. What really surprised me is both sides came up around about the same time. So that was extra great for me. Now, this one here, this one here, this one here, and this one here were all done through the separating the rhizome method. But as you can see as well, like that one got the most sun when it was young. I am going to repot this because I don't think it likes the pot that it's in. That one actually had a few more of the darker leaves with it and has had a lot more shade. And those two I've basically been trying to get away from the sun to see if they'll darken up a bit. All right, so the separation method definitely works. No hassles whatsoever. Cuttings definitely work. No hassles whatsoever. So it is quite easy. But as I said, like that's a separation and that's like taking forever, as is that. This one's growing out quite nicely. So remember, they are a very, very, very slow growing plant, but it's worth it. Give it a go. I'm going to be trying the cutting method in water shortly, probably with these ones. In fact, I might even try it with this as well, given that I'm not going to get it variegated from it anyway. And I'll end up doing a video to show how that actually works out. Other than that, see how you go. Ask any questions, like, share, and good luck with your planting.